Ahoy! The Pro League has started again, and never have we seen more changes happening in the league at once. Things are all over the place. The meta is in many ways very different, especially when it comes to builds and also to picks. And that is something I want to look into a little bit more so we can see what we can take from this information and utilize in our own games. This will take more than one video, so what we begin with in this video is looking at unusual, unexpected, out of meta picks that make it back into the meta on the first day, and in the following days we'll go into other aspects. And with this little introduction out of the way, let's get into the picks, starting with solo. The first interesting pick is Odin. Odin recently got a few buffs that decreased his cooldowns primarily and gave him a little bit of a boost on his 3 as well, and he was actually picked twice and banned twice within just the 6 games that we had. The first pick that we saw was by FineOK, who ended the game with 5 kills, 1 death and 6 assists, and had a very interesting build. He started out with Bluestone Pendant and then went into Mystical Mail, which is something we see a lot, especially from FineOK, and then opted into Talisman of Energy after that. Now, Talisman of Energy is obviously a nice item for sticking power, but it's not something I would typically expect on an Odin, considering it is focused on attack speed, at least partially. And from there he went into more expected items, Pridwen and Magi's Cloak. Hedix also played him and ended with a 4-12 slash line, and his build was even more interesting. He started out with Fighter's Mask, but then bought Warrior's Axe on the first back. After that, he built similar items to FineOK. He built Mystical Mail, Pridwen, and Talisman of Energy as well, and then a Void Shield towards the end. But I found this starter and irregular start combination very interesting. Also, in both matches, he was built with Blink and Sundering Spear. Blink, no surprise on Odin, and Sundering Spear makes a lot of sense because you can deal more damage to the target that you lock in the cage and potentially get the passive as well. In both games, Odin had insane damage output well into late game, in one game only being matched by the ADC and in the other by the Hunter, which means he is a massive threat in that regard right now. Of course, slap fights in solo and Mystical Mail play a role here, but still, these numbers holding up all the way into late game was quite impressive. As I predicted, Osiris also made a return to solo lane. He was actually built quite differently in both games. FineOK started him with Fighter's Mask and then went into Mystical Mail, Talisman of Energy, Gladiator's Shield, Winged Blade, and what would have been a Pridwen. Hedix, however, started out a lot more basic attack focused. He built Death Toll, which now procs for 75% on melee cleaves again, and his next item after that was Stone-Cutting Sword. This is an item that is very rarely used in solo lane. After that he had Talisman of Energy, so he also had massive amounts of movement speed overall. Then Void Shield, Winged Blade with even more movement speed, and Spectral Armor. Unfortunately, things didn't go so well in these games for Osiris, but he was also banned twice on top of that. A much more surprising pick to me was a Terra pick by Variety. While the 0-4-4 slash line at the end of the game wasn't particularly impressive, the fact that she was even chosen in the first place was very interesting to me. She was built with Vampiric Shroud into Breastplate of Valor, Lotus Crown, Void Stone, and Magi's Cloak, so she had a lot of early sustain overall. However, her lane opponent was Guan Yu, so he had a pretty decent amount of sustain as well. To me, it feels like you sacrifice a lot of pressure by choosing to go Terra solo, but Variety also played Sobek solo, so he doesn't seem to mind all that much, and in that case it worked out. In jungle, we didn't really have any unexpected picks so far. Daji was picked once, which was maybe a bit of a surprise, but she has been playing in the Pro League, and Thor was picked, but that is also because Sam for Soccer is just a huge Thor fan. As such, I wouldn't consider either of those a really out of meta surprise. In middle, however, things got spicy. In my recent tier list, I placed Baba Yaga as a goddess that I expected to get significant performance improvements with this patch, or increases, and exactly that has happened. She was picked 3 times and banned once in 6 matches. When Shi2 played her and went 2-1-7, he built Pendulum of Ages, or Sense of Time at the start, and Warlock stacks directly after for some early stacks, which is super easy to get with Baba Yaga's passive anyways. Then Spear of Desolation and Sharon's Coin, as well as Soul Reaver, which is making a bit of a comeback, and Soul Gem. This allowed her to have high CDR with relatively high survivability through the self-sustain and the higher health pool, as well as a fair bit of mobility with Sharon's Coin and a fair bit of tank damage with Soul Reaver. He ran that same build again in the next match, where things didn't go quite as well. Considering that she received pretty significant buffs to her ult's survivability as well as the CC, it's not surprising at all that she got picked up, and she seems to be a relatively high threat character. And speaking of high threats and unexpected picks, Big Man Tings picked Habois in middle lane and went 4-0-6. And the build is equally crazy. So he started out with Vampiric Shroud for early sustain, and he built a Charon's Coin. But then he focused heavily on building lifesteal. He built Bancroft's Talon, Soul Gem, and Typhon's Fang. I don't know what the last item would have been, but before he could finish that, he upgraded Sacrificial Shroud, meaning he would now take damage for dealing damage, but also have more power on that item, which now has 115 power, and along with the 3 other lifesteal as well as 1 healing item that he had, it was enough to not even get killed once. In support, so far we didn't see any unexpected picks. In fact, the support meta was probably the most boring one of all the pick metas that we have seen, with only Yemoja, Ymir, Fafnir and 1 Hercules pick. In carry, on the other hand, we had all kinds of spies. And the first kind of spies here was Barracuda picking Xbalanque, going 3-1-9 in the first of 2 games we was played. He built Death Toll into Ikaival, build that kind of focuses on getting a lot of early sustain, and then continued into Odysseus' Bow. Having this much attack speed early on means you getting a ton of Death Toll procs very, very quickly, which is an interesting way to utilize the sustain from that. After that he went into Kin's Eyes, and then into Titan's Bane, because that amplifies the Odysseus Bow proc on everyone. And it also prevents him from overcapping attack speed, because after that he was going into Hunter's Bow, which was likely going to be an Atalanta's Bow. But the Hunter picks in the game right after were even more interesting. Barracuda went for Hachiman, who has been out of the meta for a bit and seeing now a bit of a resurgence, and went a somewhat similar but also somewhat different build. His first item in this case was Leather Cowl, then going into Ikaival, and then going into Arcee instead of the Odysseus Bow from before, but then going into Kin's and Titan's Bane as well. However, it looks like he was looking to finish this one up with an Executioner, but it didn't really work out that well for him anyways. On the other side though, we had Netrioid, who went 2-2-7 with a somewhat similar and then also very different build. But the more important thing is who he built it on, and that was Artemis. Artemis received quite a few buffs, especially to her cooldowns and mana cost, I think, in the recent patch. And those things seem to have been enough to push her back into the meta, which is very fascinating to me. It's also fascinating is the build that comes with that. Leather Cowl, Ikaival into an early Executioner, and then into Wind Demon, Deathbringer, and Aimpoint Shuriken, so another crit item. But no stacking item inside here, just a very heavy focus on early attack speed and then relatively quick crit. Even the sustain in this build is very low, only being carried by Leather Cowl. In the last game, Barracuda played Xbalanque again with the same build as before, the one that included Odysseus Bow, but on the other side we had Netrioid playing Hou Yi. He used a small variation of his previous build here, including an Odysseus Bow this time, but overall I just have to say that the Hunter pick and build meta really is super interesting. I said before this patch that I really didn't know what was going to happen to Hunters and what direction it was going in, but so far it seems like the direction is very early attack speed through Ikaival. But outside of that, big parts of the builds look wildly different, and we seem to see a fair bit more starter variety as well. Some more notable bans worth mentioning were Artemis being a ban along with the pick as well, and Neith seeing a ban too. So from what we can tell so far, the mid-season patch has really shaken up the Pro League meta. There are still quite a few familiar faces from the previous meta, but a lot of very unexpected underdogs, in my opinion, that make it into the picks on the first day of the new patch being played. As I said, this is just the first part of this video. We'll be looking into more things like the starting strategies, some builds on the other gods and more in tomorrow's video. So if you want to see that, click like and subscribe, or I will come up with a new outro soon. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That's Vetnik Walker, Dwayne Brennan, Zelaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, Angel, Erix88, Zferoli, and everyone else you see here.